Good to see some familiar faces. First of all, I just want to start by saying anytime you're asked to return to a place that you helped build, you had a hand in.
The arrival of Caitlin Clark was supposed to mark the beginning of a dynasty, a fairy tale for a struggling franchise that had spent years buried in the shadows of the sporting world. But what happens when the dream collapses into a very public nightmare, broadcast live for the entire world to witness? When millions of new fans, drawn in by a once-in-a-generation talent, purchased tickets and jerseys, they came expecting to see music greatness. Instead, they got chaos, confusion, and a team unraveling at the seams. Music, their rage, white-hot and immediate, locked onto a single target. It grew so loud, so relentless, that the team's president, a woman who understands business far better than basketball, was compelled to step in. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't fire anyone on the spot, but she delivered a message so pointed, so unmistakable, it didn't need to be spoken aloud. The Indiana Fever was supposed to be Caitlin Clark's team, the franchise she would single-handedly drag from irrelevance into the national conversation. But it was rapidly becoming a franchise teetering on the edge of a full-scale meltdown, and the person holding the match was head coach Christie Sides. The pressure was mounting. The entire world was watching, and the clock was music, ticking louder with every catastrophic loss. The moment Caitlin Clark's name was called as the #1 overall pick in the WNBA draft, the Indiana Fever stopped being just a basketball team. It became a cultural force, a stock market sensation, music, a golden ticket stamped on a basketball. Team president Alissa Bair, an executive music, with a sharp instinct for marketing and revenue, understood this better than anyone in the building. The numbers were staggering, almost impossible to believe. Music. Ticket sales didn't simply rise, they detonated, with secondary market prices rivaling those of established NBA franchises. Merchandise vanished from shelves at a historic pace. Clark's number 22 jersey became the best-selling jersey for any draft pick in any sport, in recorded history. National television networks, which music had previously offered the WNBA little more than lukewarm interest, were now competing to air their games, bumping them from obscure cable slots to primetime on major broadcast networks. Clark wasn't just a rookie. Music. She was a one-woman economic stimulus package, a force of nature single-handedly rewriting the financial destiny of an entire league. The WNBA, for the very first time in its history, announced it would fund full-time charter flights for its teams. Music. A decision directly tied to the Caitlin Clark effect and the legitimate security concerns that came with her exploding global superstardom. This overwhelming wave of hype, money, and media scrutiny created an impossible standard to meet. Music. The expectation wasn't simply to improve, it was to dominate, immediately. And every ounce of that pressure, every dollar of that weight, born from millions in revenue and millions of new, expectant fans, came crashing down on one person, head coach Christie Sides. She had been handed the keys to a Bugatti but was expected to win the Indy 500 on her very first lap, with zero practice and a pit crew she had barely spoken to. The stage appeared set for a glorious, transformative season, but the organization, in its gold rush frenzy, seemed to forget that with massive power comes even more devastating scrutiny. And that scrutiny was about to become a public relations catastrophe threatening to incinerate the entire project before it ever left the launch pad. The season opened not with a bang, but with a brutal, deafening crash. The league schedulers showed the Fever absolutely no music mercy, hurling them headfirst into a gauntlet of veteran, championship-caliber programs like the New York Liberty and the Connecticut Sun. And the Fever were losing, badly. The initial excitement from fans who had tuned in expecting to see the Iowa Hawkeyes version 2.0 quickly soured into anxiety, and then into outright alarm. It wasn't just the defeats that stung, it was the manner of them. They were being demolished. They appeared completely lost on defense, surrendering easy layups and wide-open threes with frightening consistency. Music. The offense, which was supposed to be a highlight reel of Clark's iconic logo threes and jaw-dropping no-look passes. Music. Looked sluggish, fragmented, and embarrassingly predictable. The team led the entire league in turnovers, with Clark herself visibly seething as her passes sailed out of bounds, her teammates seemingly unprepared for the pace and surgical precision she demanded. The dream was disintegrating in real time, replaced by a cold, unflattering truth. Viewers who had tuned in for the Caitlin Clark spectacle were instead watching a team in complete and total disarray. The national media narrative, once so jubilant and celebratory, reversed overnight. Music, sports talk programs like First Take and Undisputed went from marveling at Clark's ceiling to openly interrogating the competence of the Indiana Fever's coaching staff and roster construction. Music, the electric energy that had surrounded draft night had completely dissolved, replaced by a spreading, suffocating sense of frustration and embarrassment. Music, that frustration needed somewhere to go, an outlet for the millions of fans who felt robbed of the spectacle they had been promised. And soon, they would unite music, and with razor-sharp precision, direct their outrage at one person. Music. As the losses accumulated and the on-court product looked increasingly broken, the fan base began demanding answers, and every thread of their investigation led them straight to the head coach. A massive, unprecedented online campaign against Christie Sides began taking shape. This wasn't a handful of disgruntled supporters, it was a digital army. Reddit music threads, Twitter spaces, and Facebook groups transformed into virtual command centers dedicated to breaking down every play call, music, every substitution decision, and every syllable from Sides' post-game press conferences. Fans evolved into self-taught basketball analysts, armed with screen captures and frame-by-frame replays, constructing an ever-expanding case against her. They were absolutely incensed by her substitution patterns, documenting with painstaking precision how Clark would routinely be pulled from the game at critical junctures, or, even more infuriatingly, right after she had found her rhythm and knocked down consecutive big shots. It felt deliberate. They bombarded social media with footage of an offense that appeared to willfully ignore music, its most lethal weapon. They watched Clark being deployed as a decoy, stationed in the corner while inferior plays were drawn up for less effective teammates. Music was a jarring, painful contrast to the explosive, free-flowing offense she had commanded at Iowa. Sides' public statements only poured gasoline onto an already raging inferno. When she made remarks that appeared to subtly question her rookie's defense or decision-making, fans read it not as coaching, but as a coach publicly offloading blame and throwing her young franchise cornerstone under the bus rather than accepting responsibility for the team's failures. The hashtag #FireChristieSides began trending globally on Twitter after every single loss. The very fans who were supposed to form the bedrock of this new era were now openly demanding a mutiny. In their music minds, Christie Sides wasn't just failing to win, she was actively dismantling a generational talent, mismanaging her gifts, and consistently failing to place her in a position to succeed. The outrage was building to a deafening music crescendo, but it was about to reach a terrifying new altitude, where coaching incompetence would begin to resemble something far darker than negligence. The widespread frustration then curdled into outright music fury when the rest of the league appeared to declare open season on Caitlin Clark. It became unmistakably clear that the league's veterans were going to test her, not music, just with suffocating defense, but with blatant, aggressive physicality. She was being hip-checked, thrown to the floor on plays nowhere near the ball, and targeted with cheap shots in virtually every single game. The boiling point, the moment that unified the entire fanbase against her coach, was the now infamous blindside shoulder check delivered by Chicago Music Sky's Chennedy Carter. It was a move that had absolutely no business being on a basketball court, a flagrant foul that was later upgraded to a flagrant one by the league office. Music. The world looked on in horror as Clark was blindsided from behind. But as every eye turned toward the Fever's bench expecting a response, they found nothing. Not a single player immediately confronted Carter. Not one assistant coach charged onto the floor. And in the eyes of a watching world, head coach Christie Sides stood motionless, impassive. Her perceived absence of any fiery reaction, both during the game itself and throughout her shockingly subdued post-game music press conference, where she initially minimized the entire incident, was viewed as the ultimate act of betrayal. Fans weren't interested in calm, measured professionalism. They wanted music. A coach who would go to war for her players, a coach who would publicly and ferociously defend her superstar from what they had already deemed a calculated, targeted assault. Her refusal to do so was the final straw that broke everything open. The outrage was absolutely deafening. Demands for Sides' dismissal reached a fever pitch, consuming sports media for days on end. This had long since stopped being about wins and losses. This was now about the physical safety and professional dignity of their franchise cornerstone. The fans had presented their case loudly and unmistakably, and now the front office, the people meticulously counting every dollar Clark was generating, were music, left with no choice but to pay attention. As the firestorm consumed social media and hijacked the sports news cycle entirely, Fever Music, President Alissa Bair remained publicly composed, a portrait of calculated corporate stoicism. But behind closed doors, an entirely different and far more consequential message was being transmitted, one that carried infinitely more weight than any public statement ever could. She never once referenced Christie Sides by name in a negative context. She didn't need to. Her communication arrived through precisely engineered, strategically deployed corporate language that was every bit as sharp and as cold as a surgically placed blade. Across a series of interviews, Bair repeatedly and enthusiastically spotlighted the Caitlin Clark effect on the business, detailing the franchise's massive financial transformation, the sold-out arenas night after night, music, and the unprecedented acceleration across every single revenue stream imaginable. She spoke with conviction about the absolute obligation to capitalize on this once-in-a-generation window of opportunity. Then she lowered the hammer with the single most consequential phrase, a line that reverberated through every corridor of the organization. She spoke about the supreme and non-negotiable importance, of protecting your asset. This was never merely boardroom language about insurance policies and liability clauses. It was a razor-thin, high-voltage warning aimed with surgical precision directly at the coaching staff. The message delivered to Christie Sides could not have been clearer if it had been printed on a billboard. You are the steward of the most valuable asset this franchise, and quite possibly the entire league, has ever possessed. The new television deals, the skyrocketing merchandise music revenue, the sold-out arenas, every single cent of it flows through her. Every eye in the world is on this organization, and any failure to protect and fully maximize this asset will not be tolerated under any circumstances. The stunning message was never a public termination. It was a cold, calculated, and very public performance review delivered in plain sight. The suffocating pressure now bearing down on Sides was no longer just arriving from faceless strangers firing off angry tweets. It was now descending directly from the top floor, from the very person whose signature appeared on her contract. While the combustible drama detonated in front of cameras, and echoed through the executive suite, quiet whispers began circulating about a deepening tension festering behind closed doors, inside the walls of the locker room itself. Absorbing a global icon of Caitlin Clark's magnitude into a roster of proud, battle-tested professional athletes was always going to be an extraordinarily delicate and complex undertaking. Clark was never just another hungry rookie scrapping for playing time. She was boarding private jets to the ESPYs and headlining national advertising campaigns for State Farm and Gatorade, while several of her teammates were still boarding commercial flights and navigating careers lived largely in anonymity. This constructed an unprecedented and deeply combustible dynamic that threatened to ignite at any moment. Whispers began circulating about deteriorating on-court chemistry, particularly between Clark and the previous year's #1 overall pick and reigning Rookie of the Year, Aliyah Boston. Observers and analysts openly noted how the two cornerstones frequently appeared to be operating on completely different wavelengths. With the offense repeatedly failing to engineer situations that would harness both of their extraordinary and complementary skill sets. Was there resentment festering beneath the surface? Was jealousy quietly poisoning the well? Christie Sides was now burdened not just with engineering X's and O's, but with navigating the extraordinarily fragile, complex emotional terrain of a locker room operating beneath a relentless global microscope. She had to function simultaneously as a head coach, a psychologist, and a skilled mediator, convincing a veteran roster that the rookie absorbing all the oxygen in every room was their ultimate pathway to success, not a direct threat to their professional survival. The stakes had expanded far beyond winning basketball games. This was now about preventing an entire grand and ambitious experiment from detonating from the inside. The team was being pulled violently in multiple directions by forces both on the floor and far beyond it, and Sides remained the only individual position to hold every fractured piece together. And then, at precisely the moment the entire franchise appeared destined to buckle beneath the crushing tonnage of public condemnation, and internal dysfunction, something shifted. It arrived suddenly, and it arrived dramatically. Whether it was the sustained sting of the relentless public backlash, the radiating heat from the front office's thinly veiled ultimatums, or simply a team finally discovering its identity after an absolutely punishing start, the Indiana Fever began to look like an entirely different basketball team. They started winning. The offense, which had been stagnant, predictable, and painful to observe, began running directly and unapologetically through Caitlin Clark, finally giving full expression to her otherworldly scoring range and visionary playmaking music gifts. The high pick and roll, the identical play that had been so devastatingly effective at Iowa, suddenly emerged as the undisputed engine of their entire offensive system. The team's defense, previously a sieve hemorrhaging points, music, appeared sharper, more disciplined, more connected, and considerably more menacing. Clark herself moved with greater ease, greater authority, and the on-court partnership with Aliyah Boston that had been rumored to be fracturing suddenly snapped into focus, forging music, a genuinely dangerous 1-2 combination. They assembled a winning streak, dismantling some of the very teams that had humiliated and dominated them just weeks prior. Music, the question reverberating across the entire sports world, was devastatingly simple. What changed? Was this Christie Sides standing defiantly over her critics, a misunderstood music architect revealing that her meticulous blueprint had simply required time and patience to fully take root? Or was music, this a desperate last-gasp act of professional self-preservation, a coach finally abandoning her own system entirely and surrendering to the blueprint the fans and presumably the front office had been screaming for all along? The team was finally beginning to resemble the powerhouse the entire world had envisioned from the very start, but the burning mystery of what or who had engineered the dramatic turnaround only deepened the intrigue surrounding everything. The Indiana Fever season had been nothing short of a Hollywood thriller, a high-voltage drama unfolding in real time for a global audience. It had a superstar protagonist in Caitlin Clark, a designated villain in the collective eyes of the fanbase in Christie Sides, and a high-stakes ultimatum delivered with chilling precision from the corporate suite. Music. The stunning message transmitted by Alissa Bair may not have been a formal declaration of war, but its shockwave was absorbed by every single person inside that organization with the force of a seismic event. It was a blunt, frigid reminder that in the new high-finance landscape of professional women's sports, hype alone wins nothing, and patience evaporates with terrifying speed when hundreds of millions of dollars and a once-in-a-generation opportunity hang in the balance. While Christie Sides appear to have survived the most violent portion of the storm, music, steering her team out of the basement and into legitimate playoff contention with pivotal, statement victories, the suffocating pressure had not disappeared for a single moment. Music. She was no longer simply coaching a basketball team. She was managing a global brand, shepherding a full-blown cultural movement. Music. Every loss from this point forward would be magnified under the harshest possible light. Every substitution would be picked apart and prosecuted by a relentless army of online critics armed with timestamps and receipts. Had she genuinely turned a corner and earned back the confidence of the fans and, far more critically, music, the front office? Or was she still operating entirely on borrowed time, fully aware that the woman who held the complete future of this franchise in her hands was monitoring her every single decision, poised to pull the trigger the instant the golden ticket began? Music. To lose even a fraction of its blinding, extraordinarily profitable glow? The story was far from finished. This was simply the close of the first, chaotic, and utterly unforgettable act. Music. The arrival of Caitlin Clark was supposed to signal the dawn of a dynasty, a fairy tale crafted for a struggling franchise that had spent far too long buried in the margins of the sporting world. But what happens when that dream dissolves into a very public music nightmare, streamed live for the entire planet to absorb? When millions of new fans, pulled in by a generational force of nature, spent their money on tickets and jerseys, music, they arrived expecting to witness something transcendent. Instead, they encountered chaos, dysfunction, and a team coming apart at every seam. Their fury, white-hot and surgically focused, converged on a single target. It grew so thunderous, so unrelenting, that the team's president, a woman who comprehends business at a far deeper level than she will ever comprehend basketball, was ultimately forced, music, to intervene. She didn't erupt, she didn't terminate anyone publicly, but she dispatched a message so precise, so devastatingly sharp, it required no words to land with full and terrifying impact. The Indiana Fever was designed to be Caitlin Clark's franchise, the organization she would single-handedly elevate from irrelevance into the center of the national conversation. But it was deteriorating rapidly into a franchise balanced precariously on the edge of a total and catastrophic meltdown, and the individual with her fingers wrapped around the detonator was head coach Christie Sides. The pressure had become suffocating. Every eye on the planet was fixed on this team, and the clock was ticking louder and more urgently with every humiliating, inexcusable loss. The instant Caitlin Clark's name was called as the #1 overall selection in the WNBA draft, the Indiana Fever ceased being merely a basketball franchise. It transformed into a cultural phenomenon, a Wall Street sensation, a music, golden ticket embossed on the surface of a basketball. Team president Alissa Bair, an executive armed with an almost preternatural instinct for marketing and revenue generation, grasped the magnitude of this moment more clearly than anyone else in any room she entered. The numbers that followed were staggering, almost too extraordinary to accept as reality. Ticket sales didn't simply climb, they detonated, with secondary market prices ascending to levels that rivaled those of blue-chip NBA franchises with decades of tradition behind them. Merchandise evaporated from shelves at a pace that shattered every historical benchmark the league had ever recorded. Clark's iconic number 22 jersey ascended to become the best-selling jersey of any draft music selection in any professional sport in recorded history. National television networks, which had previously extended the WNBA little more than tepid, obligatory coverage, were now engaged in fierce bidding wars for the right to broadcast their games, relocating them from forgotten cable channels to coveted primetime slots on the most watched networks in the country. Clark had long since stopped being a rookie. Music. She had become a one-woman economic revolution, a singular force of nature quietly and methodically rewriting the entire financial architecture of a league. Music. The WNBA, for the first and only time in its storied history, announced it would finance full-time charter travel for all of its franchises, a landmark decision. Music, attributed directly to the Caitlin Clark effect and the very real, very serious security considerations generated by her explosive and unprecedented global celebrity. This extraordinary tidal wave of anticipation, capital, and relentless media scrutiny erected an impossible standard that no single team could ever realistically be expected to meet. The mandate was never simply to improve, it was to dominate, without delay and without excuse. And every pound of that pressure, every dollar of that staggering financial weight flowing from millions of invested dollars and millions of newly converted, deeply expectant fans, settled entirely on the shoulders of one solitary individual, head coach Christie Sides. She had been presented with the keys to a Bugatti but was required to win the Indy Music 500 on her very first lap, without a single lap of practice and with a pit crew whose name she was still learning. The stage appeared perfectly constructed for a transformative, generational season, but the organization, consumed entirely by its gold rush music mentality, appeared to have overlooked the fundamental truth that with extraordinary power comes even more extraordinary and unforgiving scrutiny. And that scrutiny was about to evolve into a public relations catastrophe with the potential music to reduce the entire enterprise to ash before it had ever truly left the ground. The season launched not with triumph, but with a brutal, skull-rattling collision with reality. The Music League's schedule architects offered the Fever absolutely no grace, launching them without warning into a savage stretch of games against veteran, championship-caliber programs like the New York Liberty and the Connecticut Sun, and the Fever Music were losing in ways that were impossible to rationalize or excuse. The initial wave of enthusiasm from fans who had arrived expecting to witness the Iowa Hawkeyes reimagined at the professional level curdled swiftly into mounting anxiety, and then music. Raw, undisguised alarm. It was never just about the defeats themselves, it was the grotesque manner in which they were being administered. They weren't losing close games. They were being systematically dismantled. They appeared completely and hopelessly adrift on defense, surrendering uncontested layups and wide-open perimeter shots with a regularity that bordered on the surreal. The offense, engineered to deliver a nightly highlight reel built around Clark's legendary logo threes and her breathtaking arsenal of no-look passes, was instead presenting as sluggish, fractured, and criminally predictable to every opponent they faced. The team led the entire league in turnover.